Hey, it has been over 6 months since I last posted my reading wrap up video for January. It is now September, but I figured that, hey, better late than never. So back in February, I actually recorded a February reads wrap up. However, I lost that footage and ended up having to re-record it later in April, where I did both February and March together in one big YouTube video. I didn't have a whole lot of time to edit back then because I was going through job interviews, and when I was done with the job interviews, I had to go back to the office because I'm now working hybrid instead of fully remote. So I didn't have the energy to go back and edit the footage that I'd already filmed. But I do now because I'm well into my new job and I feel like I finally have the mental capacity to take this on. So I hope you enjoy my February and March video, even though it is so very fucking late. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna go over my February and March reads because I procrastinated so bad on my February reads that I figure I'm just gonna re-record it and give you one massive February reads video. February and March, sorry, it's April now. Right now, as of filming, it's April 6th, so we're well into April. In the month of February, I had read 5 books. And in March, I think I also read 5 books. Yes. Okay, so we're going over 10 books today. I hope this isn't going to be too long. But yeah, let's get started. Okay, so for the first book that I read this month, it was called One for My Enemy by Olivie Blake. She also wrote the Atlas 6 series, which I actually DNF'd. But this book, I decided to give it a chance because one of the YouTubers that I watch and trust had recommended this book and said that this was her favorite book of 2023. So I was intrigued and I picked it up and borrowed it from my library because it was available. So I gave it a read and honestly would recommend. I don't think it would be my favorite book of this year, but it was a really good book, and I think if I had been in a different headspace, I probably would have liked it more. But basically, the synopsis of the story is that it's a Romeo and Juliet retelling based in modern New York with like a magical mafia twist to it. So we follow 2 families, one all women, so it's like their mother and all their sisters, and then the other family, which is all men, which is the father and all of his sons. And they were sort of warring against each other. And I was honestly pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed this book. I felt like it was a really good Valentine's Day read or February read because it's mostly just the complex nature of like loving someone but being in like this warring family, and it had so many good characters that I enjoyed. Even the side characters were interesting in their own way. There were moments in the book that I did find kind of confusing because of like how certain things happened. Like I was confused when certain people were dead versus when they weren't. And that's like not really that much of a spoiler. It's Romeo and Juliet. Everyone fucking dies. I hope that wasn't a spoiler, like too much of a spoiler. Cause like, I mean, come on, when you think Romeo and Juliet, you know the people gonna die, all right? But yeah, like this book, because of how the magic worked, it was a little confusing in terms of like timeline on when people were dead and when they weren't. But yeah, I wish also that, in the book, they focus mostly on the oldest sister and the youngest sister on the women's side, on Juliet's side. They're not actually, nobody in this book is actually named Juliet. But I felt like the sisters had really cool magical abilities that were we only really get to see a glimpse of, and I would have really liked to have seen more of what they could do and how their lives are going, and like just yeah, their day to day, because they sound super intriguing. Overall, the book has literally everything. It's got romance, betrayal, drama, schemes, and like a bunch of likable characters. A bunch of them are very morally gray, and overall a really fun read. I gave it a 4, kind of bordering on a 4.5 stars. I just didn't give it a full 5 stars because it didn't feel like a page turner for me like other books that I'd read earlier this year had been. But still very good. I very much enjoyed it. So for the second book, I actually read this masterpiece of a book, Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. Oh my gosh, this book is... I was sitting right here. Okay, so I have, the way this room is that this is my workstation, this is where I work, and then I turn around and this is my gaming setup. So behind the camera is like my monitors. I was sitting back there, my boyfriend was sitting here playing video games, and he turns around and I'm bawling because I'm like bent over just reading this book, just like crying at how good it is. But yeah, basically this is sort of felt like a 1920s Europe during World War I, but with a fantasy twist, and you're like not actually in like Earth, you're in like an alternate universe magical world, where World War II, or actually World War I, was actually started by gods and not because some archduke got assassinated. We follow 2 main characters in this book, and they are rival journalists vying for the same columnist spot, not colonist. So the first person is Iris, and she comes from like a lower middle class family, and the other guy, his name is Roman, who is a bit more wealthy, and he's sort of like new money. Both very talented writers, and the 2 of them kind of build a relationship and a connection over this magical typewriter that sends their letters to each other. And the book kind of follows their lives as they kind of go through the war times, and how the stresses of the world around them eventually pushes them to the front, and kind of really get to see the horror and the dangers brought on by the gods and their conflict. This book is amazing and is probably going to be like in my top favorite books of all time. It is heartbreaking but inspiring and hopeful at the same time. I think that the main characters are so strong and they're so driven, and I often found moments in the book that just have like good advice that I want to take from my day-to-day. The romance in the story is very, very believable. There are 2 people who kind of just like didn't want to admit to themselves that they liked each other, and how much admiration they had for each other, and that fear of being vulnerable, which I think is very relatable when you're kind of entering a new relationship. And I loved how the letters and the typewriter kind of formed the safe medium for them to just open up and truly build that connection. It sort of reminded me of the long distance relationship with my partner, who kind of moved now, so we're not on a long distance relationship anymore, but it really captures that feeling of like falling for someone that you've never met, and the uncertainty of everything is just so cute. I freaking love it. Please read it if any of that stuff speaks to you. It's so good. I didn't read it right after. I read a book in between, but I also read Ruthless Vows, which is the second book in the series. So this one kind of carries over from the cliffhanger that was left in the first book. And I don't want to spoil too much by telling you the details, but basically the first book felt more like a civilian's perspective or a soldier's perspective, so you're kind of more on the ground, whereas this book feels more like you are like a spy. You know more, you could see the bigger picture, and the stakes felt higher, and the successes and the failures of the main characters could really like swing the tide of the war. What I liked about this book is that we get a bit more of a deep dive into the world and the gods and like the conflict that they're kind of going through. We actually get to see what the gods are like and their motivations and why they need humans to even fight their wars for them. I didn't like the fact that I felt like this book was just the other book except reversed in a way. And I loved the fact that the first book just felt very on the grounds. I'm not sure if I'm super into like being a general or being a spy. Like this one just felt more like I could see myself being forced into those situations. This was a lot. But I still think it's a great read. I would still recommend you read both of them. So for Divine Rivals, I did give it a 5-star, and for Ruthless Vows, I bumped it down to a 4. Just because it's just, I don't know, it wasn't as impactful as the first one, in my opinion. The other book that I read in February was Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, and I honestly also think Half a Soul is one of my favorite reads. It's set in Regency England, but with a fairy tale twist. And honestly, say fucking less. Like a Bridgerton with magic, I am there. So our main character, Theodora, is an orphan who, when she was young, gets attacked by a fairy who is collecting a debt that her mother had owed from when her mother was alive. The fairy was trying to take Dora's soul, but in the process of taking her soul, her cousin Vanessa stops the fairy from taking her entire soul and has left her with half a soul. And this sort of makes Dora a little bit more blunt. She doesn't have the same emotions, or they seemed a lot more dampened compared to like everyone else, and she doesn't really have that same filter that other people have. And based off of the time and the setting, this is a pretty big problem because, as you know, back then, women were very much scrutinized for, like, needing to be perfect and acting like a lady. So because her and her cousin are very close, her cousin had kind of came up with this plan to go to England in the guise of her finding a husband, but in reality she really just wanted to meet the Lord Sorcier, who Vanessa thought could help Dora undo what the fairy had done to her when she was a child. So when they get to London, they're sort of just navigating this world of keeping up appearances and going to balls and making their moms happy, but also underneath it all, they're trying to find a way to fix Dora's condition. What I really loved about this book is that it's so amazingly charming, and the dialogue is incredibly witty, and it's really funny. The chemistry between Lord Sorcier and Dora was like so well done. Have you ever had friends who you can tell immediately that they're just like a perfect match for each other? That's basically the feeling that I got with Lord Sorcier and Dora. They're just like kindred spirits that should just kiss, you know? I love that there's like a little bit of mystery in the world too, and that sort of brings them together into this common goal of just like making the world a better place. And it's so charming. I wish there was more. And it's a very, very fun read. It's very simple. It's very fast, but I really, really highly recommend it. I gave it a 5 stars, 6 stars if I could. I will recommend this to everybody for the rest of my life. So the last and final book that I read in February is Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. And it's a second book from One Dark Window. And I don't know if I can really summarize it because I'm afraid that it's gonna spoil the first book. But basically it takes place in this kingdom called Blunder, which is isolated from the rest of the world because of this magical mist that was brought in by the spirit of the wood. And in order to lift the mist, our main characters need to gather these 12 cards that basically give their holders magical abilities, and when all 12 of them combined, they are said to lift the mist. So the first book was more of setting the scene and uncovering the mystery. The second book is revealing those mysteries and the history behind the world. And we're getting more of a deep dive to a lot of the more side characters that had existed in the first book. I devoured this book. I think I finished it in like 2 days. And you really get a good glimpse of court life here that you didn't get in the first one. I loved getting to know Elm, and the romance between Elm and Ione was just like perfect. It was everything that I wanted. I love getting to know the monster more, like how sassy he is and like how witty he is, and just the way he makes fun of like other people. It's just so freaking cute. I'm really sad that this is only a duology and that there's no more, because I would have loved to explore this world a little bit further, but yeah, it was a solid duology. I would highly recommend. I gave this one a 4.5 stars. So for March, I read 5 books, and I think March is when I started to tell myself, hey, you need to read the stuff that's in your TBR shelf and not buy any more books. And I was good for a whole month up until earlier today when I bought a book. But yeah, anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. So the first book that I read for March is God Killer by Hannah Kaner. So God Killer is set in a world where gods are basically spawned by people's beliefs and prayers. And so some gods are more powerful than others, where some are a little bit more niche and much smaller. So the story follows a girl named Kissin, who's born in a country where this fire god has grown very powerful, to the point where her followers had tried to kill her and successfully killed her family as sacrifices to this fire god. Kissin, however, was saved by her father, who sacrifices himself to a water god, I think god of the ocean, and to save Kissin's life. And Kissin escapes to the neighboring country called Midrin, where a few years back gets into this big war against these wild gods. And after that war, gods in the country was outlawed, and Kissin becomes a god killer. So on her travels in this country where gods are outlawed, she comes across this girl, Inara, who has this mysterious connection with a small god of white lies named Skedi. And she kind of sees something in Inara that reminds her of herself and decides to help her. So they go off onto this journey to this old abandoned city where this war between the gods had taken place, to maybe see if they can get answers on how they can unbond Inara and Skedi from each other. But yeah, so the world I find was very interesting. I love how the gods were created, and it's based off of like people's faith in them. So you can have these really big, powerful gods, but you also have these little mouse-like gods of like broken shoes and like just, yeah, really quirky, interesting gods. And the politics of the countries are also very interesting, where like one country is like no gods, another country is like only this god, and like other countries in different continents are like all gods are welcome. So it's kind of it creates like this interesting dynamic between the people that remembered what the place was like when all gods were allowed, and what it's like now where like gods are sort of feared. And the characters in the book were very deep and believable with their own motivations and their own flaws. It's got the soft magic system, which kind of creates more of a mystery around the world, and like the curses that can be bound to people and how those manifest. And I really liked the little twist in the end. I honestly didn't see it coming, which I can't really say for too many books that I've read recently. So I gave this book a 4-star. It was a really good read. I just felt like the experience of reading the book wasn't as fun as me looking back and kind of thinking back on what happened. It was a good read, and the more that I thought about it, the more I enjoyed the story. But while I was reading it, I wasn't super hooked. But I also wasn't bored. So I gave this a 4 stars. So the second book that I read in March was Spinning Silver by Novik. And this is a Rumpelstiltskin retelling. We follow a girl named Miriam, who is a daughter of a moneylender who's very bad at collecting the money that's owed to him. So Miriam kind of takes things into her own hands, because if she didn't, her and her mom and her dad would probably starve through this very, very harsh winter. And she becomes quite good at being this like collector. Her abilities pique the interest of the Fairy King, who makes her prove herself by turning the silver he brings to her into gold. And if she didn't, he would kill her. And so as she's trying to find a way to make profit from the silver, Miriam meets Irina. And Irina is sort of the second main character in the story. There's a lot of them. It's told in multiple perspectives, but I feel like the main two is definitely Miriam and Irina. And Irina is the daughter of this ambitious duke. Unfortunately, Irina's kind of like mid. She's not particularly beautiful or talented, and all his hopes of marrying his daughter to kind of pull him up in station, it was kind of thwarted. However, there was something about an Irina that entices the new bachelor king, and he kind of immediately proposes to her. He doesn't know, however, that the king holds this really big secret. Actually, it's not a king, it's a Tsar. I think it's like set in like Regency era Russia. Like 1700s, 1800s Russia. I think it's set in like Russia or Poland or like somewhere around that area. So it's probably not a king. It's probably a Tsar. But yeah, anyways, the Tsar kind of has this little secret that she uncovers, and now you kind of have these two women who are like living the separate lives, and they both sort of have to navigate the traps that they've fallen into in order to not only just free themselves, but free the rest of the country. And I really enjoyed this book. I can't pinpoint exactly why. It's very wintry. The writing is very beautiful. It's not too flowery, but there's something about it that's just really enchanting. The characters are well written. They're very full. They're flawed, and yet they're super understandable. Like if I feel like Miriam and Irina made two very separate decisions. But if I were put in their situations, I would make the exact decisions that both of them had made. And that was like a really interesting, like, situation that I've never really been put in. I've always taken a side in majority of the books that I read. So that was a very fun read. Like I said, there's just something about it. I don't know what it is. I really don't, but I couldn't put it down, and I wanted to read every single word. Like, I wanted to savor this book as much as I possibly could. I gave it a 5-star, and I would highly recommend everyone read this because it was so good. It is a very wintry read though, so it's like a perfect, December, January, February read because it's very, very wintry. The third book that I read was Howl's Moving Castle, and I had such high hopes for this book, but I really loved the movies, and I think it ruined it for me. Honestly, there were so many times in this book that I wanted to DNF it, but I pushed through because I was like, maybe it'll get better, and it never did. What I found the most charming about the movies was Howl. He was just so irritating in the book that I couldn't get past it. And it made the romance with Sophie in the book feel so unnecessary because I just felt like they were so opposite that it was clashing and it wasn't complementary. I did, however, like that they showed more of Michael in the books and Howl's family. But yeah, just like overall, I don't know, it's just such a miss that, yeah, I gave it 2 stars, and I don't really want to talk about it anymore. The fourth book that I read was the Encyclopedia, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is also a very wintry book, and I thought that that was very deceiving because if you look at this cover, it's very flowery and swirly, so I thought it was going to be a perfect spring read. I'm in Canada, and while I was reading this, the cherry blossoms were blooming, so to be like dumped into like the coldest part of this magical world, it was kind of jarring at first, but we follow Emily, who is sort of like this awkward, meticulous, and somewhat unfeeling researcher who's trying to write a book about an encyclopedia about fairies. She actually reminds me of another character that I had read earlier this year, Theodora from, what's the, Half a Soul? Yeah, Half a Soul. So basically, Emily goes into this fishing village in the north to research about the Hidden Ones, which is these mysterious fairies. And within the first day, she manages to just offend the entire population of this village. And just kind of and this kind of hinders her research because it really requires help and interviews from locals to get even just like a, you know, like an inkling on like where she can look next. She sort of has this academic rival who is also her only friend named Wendell Bamblebee. Fucking hate that name. It's so hard to say out loud. But he's charming, he's handsome, he's overly fussy, and he follows her into this bumblefuck winter wonderland and essentially charms the entire town as soon as he gets there, and he kind of helps her uncover the mysteries behind the Hidden Ones. So this book actually has a very similar vibe to Spinning Silver, and I honestly feel like these two books could exist in the same realm, whereas Spinning Silver happened in a different part of the world, but also like a couple centuries back, whereas Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies happened a couple centuries later and in like a more western side of Europe. So yeah, I think if you enjoyed either one of these books, do pick up the other one because they do feel very similar to me. And I really enjoyed the way that this was written in Emily's point of view in terms of like journal entries. I think she's so clever and so calm, but in a way that isn't annoying, but you could also still tell how she can rub people the wrong way and why the townsfolk are just a little put off by her. I also think that the romance in this book is really well done. It's sort of like the perfect Goldilocks scenario for me, where it wasn't too much, it wasn't too little, it was just right. And I like that it almost was mostly just inferred and never really told until it had to be. And for Emily, because of who Emily is, it almost had to be told. But yeah, I was a little confused about the love interest in the very beginning. I thought it was Finn, but yeah, there must have just been something that I missed. But it eventually cleared up afterwards. Also, I was a little annoyed about how the author overemphasizes Emily's messy bun. Like, I freaking get it. After the 5th time, I was over it. Like, just, I don't care. I've pictured her with a bun this entire time. You don't need to re-mention it every 5 seconds. But yeah, overall, the book caught me by surprise. I could not put it down. I finished it in 2 days, and I honestly really enjoyed it. I give it a 5 stars. Okay, so the last book that I read in March is the Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. It's a story about Indigo, who is this very beautiful, sophisticated, rich, and mysterious woman, and it's told from the perspective of her husband and her childhood friend, Azure. From her husband's perspective, he sort of tells a story of how they met and their lives together. And from the get-go, you get the sense that they're not really on equal footing. Like, Indigo definitely wears the pants. And she makes sort of a deal with him that if they get married, he can't really ask her about her past. And her husband is just so enthralled by her that he kind of convinces himself that he is fine not knowing. But obviously, as years pass, he eventually gets curious and starts digging into her past. It's also told from Azure's perspective, who is her childhood friend, and similar to her husband, she was sort of like a moth to Indigo's flame. To Azure, outside of Indigo being an orphan, she had everything. She lived in this grand, magical house that seemed to be sentient. Indigo had this like knowledge of the other world and fairies that really intrigued Azure. She also had this aunt that loved her as a daughter, while Azure's relationship with her mom was very strained. And these two girls, at Indigo's behest, have sort of bubbled themselves from the outside world. You just sort of see these two girls grow up being super dependent on each other and living in this like bubble that they've created for themselves. And yeah, it's a very tense book where you just constantly feel eerie, and that something's not quite right with Indigo, but she holds so much power over you that you can't let go. It kind of started off a little slow for me. The husband's perspective didn't really get interesting until closer to the end, but Azure's perspective was kind of what kept me reading. It did a really good job of depicting a manipulative, toxic relationship that you just can't get out of because you feel like you're losing so much more than the other person if you let go. But yeah, I gave this book a 4 stars. It sort of has a similar vibe to Mexican Gothic, that it has this like eeriness and also like the sentient house. So if you like Mexican Gothic, I would say also pick this book up. It's also very interesting. So yeah, those were the books that I read for February and March. I actually think going forward that I'm going to continue to do this like 2-month combo instead of doing a monthly, because I've started to kind of slow down on my reading. Also in March, I've decided to take on this chunker of a book, and I feel like this one will take me a while to read. And so I think like just in general the number of books will dwindle as the years progress and life gets a little bit busier. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!